Margaret Holloway loved rules. She loved them so much that for 15 years, she had been the president of the Sunshine Acres Homeowners Association in the quiet suburb of Lakeside Hills. At 62, with her perfectly styled gray bob and collection of pastel cardigans, Margaret walked through the neighborhood like she owned it. In a way, she thought she did. Every morning, Margaret would wake up at 5:30 a.m., make her coffee, and sit by her front window. From there, she would watch the neighborhood wake up. She kept a small notebook where she wrote down violations she spotted. Trash cans left out too long. Lawns not mowed to the right height. Holiday decorations put up too early or taken down too late. Rules keep communities nice, she often said at HOA meetings. Without rules, this place would turn into a dump. The other neighbors called her Karen behind her back, but nobody dared challenge her until Thomas Chen moved in. Thomas was a 38-year-old software engineer who had just bought the beautiful corner house on Maple Drive. He was friendly, quiet, and kept to himself most of the time. His house, with its fresh paint and well-kept yard, was exactly what the HOA usually loved. But Thomas had a dream, an in-ground swimming pool for his backyard. "I grew up without one," he told his neighbor Jim. "Always wanted my own pool where I could swim any time I wanted." Thomas did everything right. He got all the proper permits from the city. He hired a licensed pool company. He even checked the HOA rules, which only stated that backyard improvements must maintain the neighborhood's character. Construction began in April. By early June, the pool was almost finished. The water sparkled blue in the summer sun, and Thomas had chosen a bright turquoise tile border that reminded him of the ocean. That's when Margaret first knocked on his door. "That tile color is unacceptable," she said, not even saying hello first. She held up her HOA rulebook. "It does not match the neighborhood aesthetic." Thomas was confused. "I checked the rules. There's nothing about pool tile colors." Margaret's face turned slightly red. "It's implied in the guidelines about maintaining neighborhood character. That bright color is too loud." "I'm sorry you feel that way," Thomas said politely, "but I have all my permits and approvals. The pool meets all requirements." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "That HOA has final say on all exterior modifications. I'll be bringing this up at the next meeting." As she walked away, Thomas felt a chill despite the warm day. He didn't know that Margaret had already blocked 3 previous homeowners from installing pools over the years. She hated them, thought they were wasteful, noisy, and lowered property values. At the HOA meeting the next week, Margaret brought up Thomas's pool as a serious violation, but something unexpected happened. When she called for a vote to force Thomas to change the tile, most board members stayed quiet. "It's just a pool tile," said Bob from 2 streets over, and he got all the proper permits. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't get her way. The look on her face made several members uncomfortable. "This isn't over," she whispered to herself as the meeting ended. Walking home that night, Margaret took a detour past Thomas's house. The pool lights were on, the turquoise tiles glowing in the darkness. Thomas was swimming laps, enjoying his new pool. Margaret stood in the shadows, watching. This new homeowner had challenged her authority and won. Nobody did that in her neighborhood. "We'll see about this," she said quietly, already forming a plan. For the next 2 weeks, Margaret watched Thomas's house like a hawk. She made notes about every small thing. His garbage can left out until 7:05 p.m., 5 minutes past the HOA rule. His grass growing to 3.2 inches, the limit was 3 inches, and the one time his newspaper sat in the driveway until noon. But Thomas wasn't breaking any major rules. This frustrated Margaret deeply. One evening, she noticed several cars parked outside Thomas's house. Walking closer, she could hear laughter and music coming from the backyard. Thomas was hosting a small gathering with 6 friends, all enjoying his new pool. Margaret marched up to his door and rang the bell repeatedly. Thomas answered, still in his swim shorts and a t-shirt. "Hello, Mrs. Holloway. Is everything okay?" "You are having a party without HOA approval," Margaret said, her voice sharp. Thomas looked confused. "It's just a few friends over for a swim. The HOA rules only require approval for gatherings of more than 15 people." Margaret's face turned red. "The noise is disturbing the neighborhood." "We're just talking and playing some music. It's only 7:30, and the noise rules don't start until 10 p.m., Thomas replied calmly. Would you like to join us? We have plenty of food. This kind offer only made Margaret angrier. She didn't want to be invited, she wanted to be obeyed. This will be reported, she said, turning to leave. The next day, Margaret started her real campaign against Thomas. She went door to door around the neighborhood. Did you know about the chemicals in that new pool? She asked Mrs. Peterson at house number 42. I've heard they can seep into the ground and affect our water. Really? Is that true? Mrs. Peterson asked, concerned. Many studies show it, Margaret lied. And the noise. Did you hear that party last night? This is just the beginning. By the end of the week, Margaret had spoken to most neighbors, planting seeds of doubt about Thomas and his pool. She even printed flyers with the heading Health Alert, pool chemicals in our community, and put them in mailboxes. Thomas found one of these flyers and was shocked. Not only were the claims completely false, but using mailboxes for unofficial flyers was against federal law. He decided to talk to Margaret directly. He knocked on her door on Saturday morning. Mrs. Holloway, we need to talk about these flyers you're distributing, he said when she opened the door. I don't know what you're talking about, she replied, though a stack of the flyers was visible on her entryway table. These contain false information about my pool. The chemicals I use are standard and completely safe. You're causing unnecessary worry in the neighborhood. Margaret crossed her arms. If you had chosen an appropriate pool design in the first place, none of this would be happening. This has gone beyond a design disagreement, Thomas said firmly. These flyers are defamatory. I'm asking you nicely to stop spreading false information. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Are you threatening me? No, I'm just asking you to stop. If you don't, I'll have to consider legal options. As Thomas walked away, Margaret felt a rage she hadn't experienced in years. No one in Sunshine Acres had ever threatened legal action against her. She was the one who enforced the rules, who kept order. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She paced her living room, thinking about the turquoise tiles, about Thomas's calm confidence, about the laughter she'd heard from his backyard gathering. He can't win, she whispered to herself. Nobody challenges me in my neighborhood. The next morning, Margaret called an emergency HOA board meeting. She had a new plan forming, one that would solve the Thomas Chen problem once and for all. The emergency HOA meeting did not go as Margaret had planned. Instead of supporting her campaign against Thomas, several board members questioned her actions. Sending flyers about pool chemicals seems extreme, said Bob, the retired chemistry teacher. Those chemicals are used in every pool in America. And going door to door to complain about a small gathering, added Lisa from Oak Street. That wasn't even an HOA violation. Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. For years, these same people had followed her lead without question. Now they were challenging her authority. You don't understand the bigger picture, Margaret said, her voice rising. This new homeowner thinks he can ignore our community standards. Today, it's a pool with inappropriate colors. Tomorrow, who knows? Purple houses, lawn statues, trampolines. The other board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Margaret's reaction seemed out of proportion. Maybe we should just move on, suggested Mike, the treasurer. There are more important things to discuss, like the community playground repairs. Margaret left the meeting fuming. Walking home, she passed Thomas's house and saw him in the front yard, planting new flowers along his walkway. He waved politely. This simple gesture made her blood boil. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep again. She kept thinking about how Thomas was turning everyone against her. Her 15 years of maintaining perfect order in Sunshine Acres were being threatened by one man with a turquoise-tiled pool. The next morning, she spotted a delivery truck at Thomas's house. The driver unloaded a large box labeled Security Camera System. Margaret watched from behind her curtains as Thomas installed cameras at the corners of his house and one facing the backyard pool. So he doesn't trust his neighbors now, she muttered. Typical. Later that afternoon, Margaret was checking her mail when Thomas's next-door neighbor, Elaine, walked by. Have you heard? Elaine asked. Thomas is going away for a business trip next week, 2 weeks in Seattle for some big tech conference. Margaret's face showed no reaction, but her mind was suddenly racing with possibilities. Is that so? Well, I hope he has a good trip. After Elaine left, Margaret went inside and pulled out the HOA emergency contact list. As president, she had keys to every house in the neighborhood, meant to be used only for emergencies like water leaks or fire. She found Thomas's entry and stared at it for a long time. Then she went to her computer and started searching for local concrete companies. The next day, Thomas was loading his suitcase into his car when Margaret approached him. Heading out of town, she asked with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Thomas looked surprised at her friendly tone. Yes, 2 weeks in Seattle for work. Don't worry about your house. As HOA president, I keep an eye on everything while people are away. Thanks, Thomas said hesitantly. But I've asked my friend Jim to check in every few days, and I've installed security cameras, just to be safe. Margaret's smile tightened. Cameras? Do those face any community areas? Because that would require HOA approval. They only monitor my property, Thomas replied, closing his trunk. Anyway, I should get going to catch my flight. Have a nice 2 weeks, Mrs. Holloway. As Thomas drove away, Margaret watched with narrowed eyes. Security cameras complicated things, but she wasn't deterred. She had spent 15 years protecting Sunshine Acres from people who didn't respect the rules. This pool situation needed to be handled. That evening, Margaret made 3 phone calls. The first was to a concrete company called Fast Fill Solutions. The second was to a friend at the bank who handled the HOA accounts. The third was to Jim, Thomas's friend. Hello, Jim. This is Margaret Holloway from the HOA. About checking Thomas's house, there's been a change of plans. When she hung up the phone, Margaret felt calm for the first time in weeks. She had finally figured out how to solve the problem permanently. Monday morning dawned bright and clear in Sunshine Acres. Margaret woke up early, dressed carefully in her most professional-looking outfit, a navy blue pantsuit with a cream blouse, and checked her appearance in the mirror. Today was the day she would restore order to her neighborhood. At precisely 8:00 a.m., a white truck with Fast Fill Solutions, painted on the side, pulled up in front of her house. 2 men in work clothes stepped out and approached her door. Mrs. Holloway, the taller man asked when she answered. I'm Mike from Fast Fill. We spoke on the phone about the urgent pool fill job. Yes, thank you for coming so promptly, Margaret said, using her most official tone. As I explained, this is a neighborhood emergency. She led the men to her car, a beige sedan as plain and proper as she was. I'll drive you to the property. The homeowner is out of town, but as HOA president, I have emergency access authorization. At Thomas's house, Margaret used her emergency key to open the side gate that led to the backyard. She noticed the security cameras and felt a moment of hesitation, but quickly pushed it aside. The cameras are being replaced today, she told the workers confidently. They're not functioning right now. Mike looked around at the beautiful pool with its turquoise tile border. Ma'am, are you sure about this? This looks like a perfectly good pool. Margaret's face hardened. The structural assessment found serious issues. The pool is leaking chemicals into the groundwater, threatening the whole neighborhood. We have to act immediately, while the homeowner is away on business. Do you have the paperwork for that assessment? Mike asked. Margaret opened her purse and pulled out several official-looking documents with the HOA letterhead. Everything is in order. The homeowner has been notified, and we can't wait for his return to address this serious health concern. The workers still looked uncertain, but the documents appeared legitimate. And why would an HOA president lie about something like this? We'll need the payment before we begin, Mike said. Of course, Margaret replied, handing over an HOA check for $7,000 that she had prepared the day before. This covers everything we discussed. For the next 4 hours, Margaret sat in a lawn chair, watching with growing satisfaction as the workers poured load after load of concrete into Thomas's once beautiful pool. The turquoise tiles disappeared beneath the gray sludge. The sparkling water was gone. A few neighbors noticed the activity and came by to ask questions. What's happening to Thomas's pool? Asked Elaine, looking concerned. Emergency remediation, Margaret explained smoothly. We discovered it was leaking dangerous chemicals into the soil, that HOA had to act quickly to protect everyone. Shouldn't Thomas be here for this? Elaine pressed. He was notified immediately, of course, Margaret lied. But he authorized us to proceed without delay for community safety. They'll be properly compensated for the necessary removal. By early afternoon, the job was complete. Where Thomas's dream pool had been that morning, there was now just a solid concrete slab. The workers packed up their equipment and left. Margaret stood alone in the backyard, looking at her handiwork with a sense of triumph. The icer was gone. The threat to her authority eliminated. Order restored. As she locked the gate behind her, she noticed Thomas's security camera pointed directly at where she stood. For a moment, doubt flickered across her face. Then she straightened her shoulders and walked away. Security is an HOA violation anyway, she muttered to herself. You'll thank me later for saving the neighborhood from those chemicals. That night, Margaret slept better than she had in weeks. In her dreams, she saw herself being given an award for most dedicated HOA president, while the residents of Sunshine Acres applauded her heroic actions. She had no idea that at that very moment, Thomas Chen was sitting in his Seattle hotel room, staring in horror at the security footage on his phone, watching as his $85,000 pool disappeared under tons of concrete. Thomas Chen sat frozen in his Seattle hotel room, unable to believe what he was seeing on his phone. The security camera footage showed his beautiful backyard pool being filled with concrete, while Margaret Holloway supervised from a lawn chair. His hands shook as he rewound and watched the video 3 more times. This can't be real, he whispered to himself, but the evidence was clear on his screen. At first, Thomas felt numb with shock. Then came waves of anger, confusion, and disbelief. He had installed the security system just in time, almost as if some part of him had expected Margaret might try something. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. Thomas's first call was to Jim, his friend who was supposed to check on the house. Margaret told me there was a water leak in the neighborhood, and the city asked everyone to stay away from the affected homes for safety, Jim explained, his voice filled with guilt. I believed her. She showed me what looked like an official notice. Thomas's next call was to the local police department. I need to report a major act of vandalism and destruction of property, he told the dispatcher, his voice surprisingly calm given the circumstances. And I have it all on video. The police told him they would send officers to check his property immediately. Thomas booked the first flight home, packed his bags in a rush, and headed to the airport, his mind racing with questions. How could someone destroy his property like this? What gave Margaret the right? How was this even possible? 5 hours later, Thomas's rideshare pulled up to his house. 2 police cars were parked outside, their lights flashing silently in the evening darkness. A small group of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, whispering among themselves. Officer Rodriguez, a serious-looking woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, met Thomas at his front door. Mr. Chen, I'm sorry about what's happened to your property, she said. We've reviewed your security footage and documented the damage. This is one of the most bizarre cases of property destruction I've seen in my 15 years on the force. Thomas walked through his house and out to the backyard. Even though he had seen the footage, the sight of his pool, now just a gray concrete slab, hit him like a physical blow. He had spent years saving for that pool, designing every detail, choosing those special turquoise tiles that reminded him of family vacations in Mexico as a child. We'd like you to come to the station to make a formal statement, Officer Rodriguez said. The district attorney has already been notified. Based on the evidence, we're looking at multiple serious charges. As Thomas followed the police to their car, his neighbor Elaine rushed over. Thomas, I'm so sorry, she said, her eyes wide. Margaret told everyone it was an emergency chemical leak. She said you knew about it and had approved everything. Thomas shook his head slowly. I never approved anything. I was completely blindsided. At the police station, Detective Powell, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, explained the situation to Thomas as they reviewed the security footage together. What we're seeing here isn't just simple vandalism, Powell said, his tone serious. Based on this evidence, Mrs. Holloway has potentially committed several felonies: criminal destruction of property, fraud, trespassing, and misappropriation of HOA funds. The concrete company has already provided a statement saying they were told this was an emergency HOA action approved by the homeowner. Will she go to jail? Thomas asked, still trying to process everything. With the dollar amount of damage and the premeditated nature of the act, she's facing potential prison time, Powell confirmed. The DA is particularly interested in the case because of the abuse of position and trust as HOA president. As Thomas gave his statement, reality finally began to sink in. His pool was gone. His peaceful life in his new home had been shattered, and his HOA president was about to face serious criminal charges for an act of destruction that defied all logic and reason. For the first time that day, Thomas allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened, and he wondered what kind of person would go to such extreme lengths over some turquoise pool tiles. Margaret Holloway was in the middle of the monthly HOA meeting when the police arrived. She stood at the front of the community center room, discussing the upcoming flower planting schedule for the neighborhood entrance, when the double doors opened. 2 uniformed officers and Detective Powell walked in. The room fell silent. 25 homeowners turned to stare as the officers approached the front. "Margaret Holloway?" Detective Powell asked, though he already knew who she was. Margaret straightened her cardigan. "Yes, that's me. We're in the middle of an important meeting. Could this wait?" "I'm afraid not," Powell said. "Margaret Holloway, you're under arrest for criminal destruction of property, fraud, trespassing, and misappropriation of funds." A collective gasp went through the room. Margaret's face drained of color. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising. "I was acting in my official capacity as HOA president to address an emergency situation. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back," Officer Rodriguez said firmly. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Margaret looked around the room desperately. "This is all a misunderstanding. I was protecting our neighborhood from dangerous chemicals leaking from that inappropriate pool." Bob, the retired chemistry teacher, stood up. "Margaret, there were no dangerous chemicals. It was a standard swimming pool with regular chlorine treatment." "The board never approved any pool removal," added Lisa, holding up the HOA meeting minutes book. "And we certainly never authorized using $7,000 of HOA funds for it." As the officers led Margaret toward the door, her shock turned to anger. "That Chen man has turned you all against me. I protected this neighborhood for 15 years. I've kept our property values high. That pool was just the beginning of the decline." The community room doors closed behind them, cutting off Margaret's protests. At the police station, Margaret sat in the interview room, still not fully comprehending the seriousness of her situation. When her attorney arrived, a nervous young man named David who had never handled a criminal case before, she insisted it was all a misunderstanding. "Show them the HOA bylaws," she told David. "I have emergency authority." "Mrs. Holloway," David said gently, "I've reviewed the bylaws. The emergency key access is only for actual emergencies like fires or flooding, and it specifically states that HOA funds over $500 require board approval with documented minutes." "It was an emergency," Margaret insisted. "That pool was a violation." Detective Powell entered the room and set up a laptop. "Mrs. Holloway, I'd like you to watch something." He played Thomas's security footage. Margaret watched herself directing the concrete workers, sitting in the lawn chair, and speaking to neighbors with what were now obviously lies. "That camera was an HOA violation," Margaret said weakly. "The district attorney has reviewed this case," Powell said, ignoring her comment. "Based on the evidence and the dollar amount of damage, $85,000 for the pool plus $15,000 for removal of the concrete, you're facing felony charges that carry potential prison time." "Prison," Margaret whispered, the color draining from her face again. "But I'm the HOA president." "That's part of the problem," Powell explained. "You abused a position of trust. You used HOA funds without authorization. You lied to the concrete company. You trespassed on private property, and you destroyed a valuable asset." For the first time, Margaret began to understand the gravity of what she had done. This wasn't like issuing a fine for an unapproved mailbox or sending a warning letter about lawn height. This was serious. Criminal. Felony-level serious. I didn't think," she started. "That's clear," Powell said. "You didn't think about the legal consequences, but now you'll have plenty of time to think about them." As Margaret sat in the interview room, the reality of her situation finally hit her. Her perfect life in Sunshine Acres was over. Her reputation was destroyed, and the legal battle ahead would be nothing like enforcing HOA rules. All because of some turquoise pool tiles that had offended her sense of order. News of Margaret's arrest spread through Sunshine Acres like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone in the neighborhood knew what had happened to Thomas's pool and why their HOA president had been led away in handcuffs. For many residents, the initial shock quickly turned to something else: relief. "I was afraid to paint my front door blue for 5 years," admitted Sarah from Elm Street during an impromptu gathering at the community center. "Margaret sent me 3 warning letters when I just mentioned the idea. She made my son take down his basketball hoop," added Mark from Pine Lane. "Said it was visually disruptive to the neighborhood aesthetic. He was 12 and heartbroken." As more neighbors shared their stories, a disturbing pattern emerged. For 15 years, Margaret had ruled Sunshine Acres through intimidation and selective enforcement of rules, many of which didn't actually exist in the HOA bylaws. Thomas attended the emergency board meeting called to address the situation. He was surprised by how many people approached him with apologies and support. "We should have stood up to her years ago," Bob told him, "but she made everyone feel like they'd be the next target if they spoke up." The interim HOA president, Lisa, called for an official audit of the association's books. The results were shocking. Over the years, Margaret had used HOA funds for personal vendettas against homeowners who challenged her authority. The concrete company wasn't the first vendor she had paid with community money to enforce her personal vision of the neighborhood. She spent $3,500 last year to have the Johnsons' rose garden removed while they were on vacation, the accountant reported. The paperwork claimed it was an emergency weed abatement. "Those roses won county awards," gasped Elaine. "The Johnsons moved away right after that happened." "And $2,200 to have the Martins' vintage car towed from their own driveway," the accountant continued. "Listed as removal of abandoned vehicle, even though it was registered and they drove it regularly." As the full extent of Margaret's actions came to light, the district attorney's office expanded their investigation. They began interviewing former residents who had moved away after conflicts with Margaret. The Johnsons returned to Sunshine Acres to give statements about their roses. The Martins explained how Margaret had targeted them after they questioned an HOA fee increase. 3 other former residents shared similar stories of harassment and property damage. For Thomas, the growing case against Margaret brought mixed feelings. He was glad to see justice being pursued, but he still had to deal with the concrete-filled hole in his backyard. "The insurance company is calling it intentional damage by a third party," he explained to his neighbors. "They'll cover some of it, but not all." That's when something unexpected happened. Lisa stood up at the community meeting. "The audit shows we have a healthy reserve fund that Margaret kept hidden from most of us," she announced. "I propose we use part of it to help Thomas restore his property. After all, this happened because our HOA failed to properly oversee its president." The vote was unanimous. The community that had lived in fear of Margaret for years now united to help repair the damage she had caused. Local news stations picked up the story, interviewing residents about the Concrete Karen incident, as it became known. Security camera footage of the pool being filled with cement went viral online, drawing millions of views and thousands of comments from people sharing their own HOA horror stories. As work began to remove the concrete from Thomas's backyard, something changed in Sunshine Acres. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other for years now stopped to chat, united by their shared experience. People began helping each other with yard work and home repairs. Community cookouts became regular weekend events. "It's like we're finally a real neighborhood," Jim told Thomas as they watched the concrete removal crew at work. "Not just houses near each other where everyone's afraid of getting a violation notice." Thomas nodded, realizing that from the destruction of his pool, something valuable had emerged. A community finding its voice after years of silence. 6 months after the Concrete Karen incident, Sunshine Acres looked different. Not just physically, with fresh flowers at the neighborhood entrance and new playground equipment, but in how people lived there. Neighbors waved to each other. Children played outside without parents nervously checking for rule violations. Front doors were painted in various colors, including blue. The courthouse was packed on the day of Margaret's sentencing. Thomas sat in the front row, along with Bob, Lisa, and several other Sunshine Acres residents. Margaret looked much smaller now, her once perfect bob grown out unevenly, her confident posture replaced by a nervous slouch. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Wilson entered the courtroom. Margaret had taken a plea deal to avoid a full trial. With the mountain of evidence against her, including security footage, financial records, and dozens of witness statements, her lawyer had advised it was her best option. Margaret Holloway, Judge Wilson began, looking over his glasses at her. This court has rarely seen such a blatant abuse of position and trust in a community setting. The judge reviewed the charges: felony destruction of property, fraud, misappropriation of funds, trespassing, and filing false reports. The total damage across all the cases discovered during the investigation exceeded $150,000. What makes this case particularly troubling, the judge continued, is the pattern of behavior over many years. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a systematic campaign of intimidation and property damage against homeowners who simply wished to enjoy their own homes. Margaret kept her eyes down as the judge delivered her sentence: 14 months in state prison, 5 years of probation, and restitution payments totaling $125,000 to Thomas and $42,000 to the HOA. As the bailiff led Margaret away, she finally looked up and caught Thomas's eye. He expected to see anger, but instead saw something unexpected: shame. For the first time, Margaret seemed to understand what she had done. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked Thomas for his reaction. "I'm just glad it's over," he said simply. "Now our neighborhood can heal and move forward." 3 weeks later, construction began on Thomas's new pool. This time, the entire community seemed invested in the project. Neighbors brought food for the workers. Children watched excitedly as the hole was dug and the frame installed. That HOA's contribution, combined with insurance and Margaret's initial restitution payment, covered the full cost. When it came time to choose the tile border, Thomas had a surprise for everyone. "I'm going with the same turquoise tiles," he announced at the community cookout, "maybe even a shade brighter." People laughed and applauded. The color that had once triggered Margaret's rage now became a symbol of the neighborhood's transformation. On the day the pool was completed, Thomas hosted a neighborhood pool party. Almost everyone from Sunshine Acres attended. Children splashed in the water while adults enjoyed food and conversation on the new pool deck. The newly elected HOA board, now consisting of 5 members including Thomas, gathered near the grill. "We've rewritten the bylaws," Lisa explained, holding up a much thinner document than Margaret's rule book. "Simple, clear rules that focus on maintaining property values without controlling every detail of people's homes. And we've set term limits for board members," added Bob. 2 years maximum as president. No more lifetime dictators." As the sun began to set, Thomas looked around at his neighbors enjoying themselves in his backyard. The turquoise tiles glowed in the evening light, beautiful and defiant. "I think we should make this an annual tradition," Jim suggested. "The Sunshine Acres pool party." "I'd like that," Thomas said with a smile, a reminder that this is our community, not just a collection of rules. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Thomas sat alone by his new pool. The journey from destruction to rebuilding had been long and difficult, but something good had come from it. A neighborhood had found its voice. People had connected with each other. And one man's simple dream of having a pool with turquoise tiles had ultimately brought positive change to an entire community. Thomas dipped his feet in the water and smiled. Sometimes, standing up for the small things, like the color of pool tiles, ended up being about something much bigger after all.